Okay, YouTube, in our last couple of videos, we've discussed sampling when it comes to collecting data and talking about also bias samples. In this video, we're going to be looking at is basically the methods of collecting data for our study here. So in our grand scheme of the steps that we take in our study here, we say that we've talked about choosing a sample that is representative of the population. What we're going to be discussing now is how we actually go about collecting that data in an appropriate way. And so there are four primary methods that you're going to see here, statistically speaking, that people use in terms of collecting data. We're going to talk about all four of these here, starting with the pinnacle here of all, I guess, experimental studies. This is the one that's called experimental. Excuse me, but we say an experiment. This method of collecting data basically imposes a treatment on individuals in order to collect data. So basically what I want you to see is that the researcher, okay, does something to affect outcomes essentially. And so when we look at something like that, the researcher is involved. So they impose a treatment on individuals in order to collect data on their response to, say, such a treatment. So the treatment, it may be a medical treatment, or it could be any action that might affect a variable in the experiment. So this is what we say, the researcher does something to affect outcomes. They may affect the variable that we're trying to measure, maybe such as weight loss on a certain, diet program. Some people get the diet program, the other people don't. We record the data and talk about how that variable was affected by our treatment or our intervention as a researcher. So we say, as an example, it says such as adding methanol to gasoline and then measuring its effect on fuel efficiency. We would want to compare the outcomes, but we have imposed the treatment. Now this is substantially different from what we call an observational study. When we talk about an observational study, we say it observes individuals and measures variables without them controlling the individuals or their environment. And so we'd say the researcher, in this case, does nothing. It's very hands-off. All they do is observe. Okay, that's it. They're just going to observe what happens. So we say that this type of study is used when it's difficult to control or isolate the variable being studied, or at least when it may be unethical to subject people to a certain treatment or to withhold it from them. So basically, we don't want to starve people, we don't want to electrocute people, we don't want to do things like that. Okay, but if we're going to study a natural phenomenon, maybe we just study it from the corner. Okay, we don't impose these treatments or ill effects upon people. So we say an observational study, these are convenient a lot of the times because it might be hard to control your variables. Now, these last two here, survey and simulation, these are kind of used a lot as well. But in other kind of areas, we say a survey is an investigation of one or more characteristics of a population. In a survey, every member of a sample is asked one or more questions. So we say this is not looking at one variable, but this is more of a multiple item analysis here. Item analysis traditionally. So analysis. We could ask one question, but basically what we're going to see here is we usually ask many questions, and we ask it of several people from the population. And then lastly, a simulation. These are things like you see maybe Mythbusters, right? We don't want to hurt people, dangerous situations like that, okay? They get to test them. That's really cool. They actually get to do simulations there. But we don't want to simulate real world things that have dangerous outcomes because that would be kind of an unethical thing. So what we'll do is this, we'll use a model to kind of reproduce conditions of a situation or process so that the simulated outcomes are intended to match what would actually happen if we did this on a scaled up model or a real kind of world situation. So a simulation, we do these sometimes like a computer simulation. It could be a computer simulation, or we could say small scale simulation for a large scale event, okay? But basically it's something that we use to reproduce conditions but aren't true conditions, okay? So in terms of all of these methods of collecting data, what we want to do basically here is with these items, we want to identify the method of data collection that each situation describes and kind of talk about being able to identify these. So with letter A here, it says that a researcher records whether people at a gas station use hand sanitizer. So when we're recording this, my first question is, are we hands-on? Are we doing something to change how people might behave in terms of washing their hands? And I'd say no. And so in that case, we're not performing an experimental kind of method in terms of collecting our data here. Now, in terms of what these other three might, how they might match this, we say an observational study would just observe these individuals. A survey would be a multiple item kind of assessment for these individuals. And then a simulation would be, we would set up something that is not like the actual gas station, but similar to the gas station. So I would say out of all three of those, this one is most likely are most like the observational study. So the observational study, simply because all we did was just observe and record. Now, letter B here, it says a landscaper fertilizes 20 lawns with regular fertilizer mix and then 20 lawns with a new organic fertilizer mix. Then they, compare the lawns after 10 weeks and determine which one's better. Because what this researcher or landscaper has done has imposed, a change that would affect the variable here, which is which one performs better, then this would be an experimental collection of data. So we say experimental study here would be the one we're using, not an observational study. Now these last three, excuse me, I want you to pause the video and try these on your own, but when you're ready to go, let's take a look at them. Number 5, it says members of a student council at your school ask every 8th student who enters the cafeteria whether they like snacks and the school's vending machine. So they are asking a yes or no question. Now, they're not doing anything to affect people's answers, so this wouldn't be experimental, but we could say an observational study, we're measuring the variable without controlling individuals at their environment. So since we're asking, I'm kind of inclined to say that we are observing what people's responses are, but maybe this could be a survey. Now, I notice that I wrote a multiple item analysis down here, but if we had one question, this could still be considered a survey procedure here, okay? So we didn't simulate how people buy things, and we didn't sit there and watch them do it, but we would say that we did a survey here. Now, number 6, when you read this, it says a park ranger measures and records the heights of trees in the park as they grow. Basically, I would say that you're just recording. This should have been observational, and for our last situation here, it says a researcher uses a computer program to help determine how fast influenza virus might spread within a city. So instead of infecting everybody, what this researcher might do is just run a computer program, which would be a simulation. Okay. Cheers.